everybody, and welcome to the European School of Theosophy and to this lecture on Saturday, the 5th of December 2020. And this evening we have great pleasure in welcoming Orlando Fernandez, Dr. Orlando Fernandez. Orlando is the son of a wise woman of the Conchero magical tradition in Mexico. He started his spiritual journey at a very early age, participating in festivals and open-air rituals, very often performed at the top of forgotten pyramids set in the volcanic landscape of his native land. Some years ago, while reading pure mathematics, Orlando discovered his true spiritual love, the Western esoteric tradition. The charms of Rosicrucianism, alchemy, and theosophy proved to be an irresistible attraction. And since then, Orlando has been studying and participating in the practical work of several esoteric fraternities. In particular, he's been a member of the Theosophical Society in England for several years, where he's been invited to give lectures to his fellow theosophists on several occasions. Orlando likes to emphasize that he has approached the esoteric not only from the practical side, but he also has a keen interest in the philosophical and the scholarly aspects of the esoteric. Orlando completed an MA in Western esotericism at the University of Exeter, writing a memoir on music and esotericism in the 20th century. Having obtained a PhD in mathematical physics from the University of Paris, followed by a series of postgraduate research work in King's College, London, and being trained as a scientist, Orlando is also very interested in the relationship between science and the esoteric, and has written a PhD dissertation, Esoteric Quantization, the Influence of the Esoteric Imagination in the Interpretation of Quantum Mechanics. Orlando also likes to point out that his spiritual journey is not limited to the Western tradition, as he's been engaged with the practical side of Kashmir Shaivism, and he's pursuing a serious program of yoga in Srinagar, Rishikesh, and Varanasi. So today, Orlando's lecture will explore the Bohm-Krishnamurti dialogues, which is part of his PhD research in Western esotericism. And it's available for download, and I'll give that at the end. And the title of Orlando's lecture is, What did the Bohm-Krishnamurti dialogues do for us?
Thank you. Thank you. Let me now share my screen, if I manage. Oh, sorry. Oh, what I'm doing here. Can you see it? Okay. Right. The Bohm, is everybody hearing me properly? Yeah, everybody. So the Bohm-Krishnamurti dialogues, so that's a painting by the Mexican painter Remedios Varo, which many times she painted these strange scientist, magicians, a surrealist painter. So thank you for inviting me to talk again. It's very nice to talk to my fellow theosophists, always so friendly and warm. And my aim today will be to share with you some of the conclusions that I obtained during my PhD research that I did for on the relationship between esotericism and science in the 20th century. So it's my thesis. Yes, it's available for download. I will show you. That's the address. Everything that I will say today is much more elaborated in the thesis, and I hope you go and read it. So this research is on the relationship between esotericism and science, in particular in the 20th century. We know a lot about the relationship between science and esoteric in the Renaissance, as from the studies of Dame Frances Yates. It has been clear that modern science has been the product of the magicians of the Renaissance. But then, during the 19th century, there are all this materialistic philosophy kind of downplay the relationship that has been always there, in particular in contemporary science. So my thesis was aiming to elicit that relationship in a more evident way. My research concentrated on David Bohm, because he's an example of a scientist with a strong esoteric leanings. That was part of the work, show the esotericism of Bohm in the 20th century. And this is an important aspect, because this relationship is not a relationship between two Platonic categories, a thing science, a thing called esoteric that live we don't know where, and that they have a relationship. Not like that. It's about a man. It's kind of anthropological. I mean, this relationship exists in people. And David Bohm is an interesting, a very important example of this relationship. So I was interested in Bohm. I was not so much interested in Krishnamurti himself, because my interest in Krishnamurti is because he was one of the most important esoteric influences in Bohm. But I want to make the stress that my interest was in Bohm himself, because I have a scientific background, and of course an esoteric background. So I felt a great affinity with his standpoint and how he wanted to bring the esoteric to his science, because in contrast to other scientists that are also interested in philosophy, the science and the philosophy are a little bit apart. Bohm was a holist, and I will talk about this in a second, a holist thinker. His research, his interest in life and in philosophy went to the science, yeah? And you could see these thoughts, these philosophical thoughts that were very important for him in the equations. And I think it's important. So those are my aims, to talk a little bit about David Bohm, and also in relationship with Krishnamurti and these dialogues. So this is the game plan, my aims today. So I will begin to talk a little bit about David Bohm, and then who he was, and then why is he one of the most important scientists of the 20th century. And also, I think it's important to understand a little bit of his science, and I will talk about the causal interpretation, which is the scientific aspect of him that is most remembered, sadly, because there is more, what I call the ontological interpretation. I will not go too much into the ontological interpretation, but to understand a little bit what Bohm and Krishnamurti were talking about in their dialogues, we need to understand a little bit more Bohm, because these dialogues were driven by Bohm. Bohm was choosing the subjects and leading the conversation. It was not Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti was, of course, adding a lot and participating, and it was the dialogue between them. But the actual subject matter of this is Bohm, who was leading these dialogues. And this is important to put them in the context of his science, as he was a scientist. Then I will talk about certain aspects of Bohm's esotericism. Why is he Bohm an esoteric thinker, which some people may react to. So I will talk briefly why, and a very, very specific moment in the thought of Bohm that show how close to an esoteric form his thought was. Actually, the thesis apart is kind of divided in two parts. The second part is putting Bohm's thought, result from a lot of the dialogues, into the methodological form in which modern Western esotericism is studied. there is a methodology which is the most well accepted, which is Febre's methodology, and Bohm's thought fits there like a glove, and that's what I did in the last chapters of my thesis. So I will then go and talk a little bit more about the dialogues, where you can find them. Yeah, in the thesis there is a description of all of them, who they are, the recorded ones, etc. But then more importantly, where you can find them. That's an interesting point. Then I will speak a little bit about the ontological interpretation, because everything that these two discuss and the philosophical standpoint ended up in the ontological interpretation, and it has been completely ignored, completely ignored by scientists, by philosophers, etc. And it's because it's more complicated, and it is the last interpretation effort, and it's very important, but it's not mainstream. Then after that, I will talk about a little bit of the consequences of all this, which I call a practical stuff, which is called Bohm's yoga. Well, as part of the Krishnamurti dialogues, I will talk a little bit. I cannot talk about all the contents and all the things that they were discussing, but there is a couple of points that are very, very important for the after, so the after Bohm-Krishnamurti relationship. And then those are very pertinent to what I am calling Bohm's yoga, which is a dialogue. He created a form of dialogue. And then after that, I will go into some conclusions. And those who have heard my talks on tarot, they will be a little bit puzzled why there is no tarot in the other subjects. Well, there is tarot in the conclusion. So I will have some things to say about the relationship between science and the esotericism that come up in the tarot, right? So David Bohm, born in 1917, dead in 1992. A good biography is his friends David Pitt's Infinite Potential, The Life and Times of David Bohm. And you see there his natal chart. You see he was a Sagittarius. The sun is very close to the midheaven, a public person. But you can see that he had his share of difficult aspects, a lot of oppositions and quadratures, and specifically with in regards with modernity and his discoveries as he experienced in his life. He experienced a lot of opposition from the mainstream publicly. So it's an interesting chart. So Sagittarius, right? Person. So this is David Bohm, and he actually made a huge impact. The Albert Einstein is talking about the need for a radical new quantum theory that includes gravity. Of course, this fits into the problem that physics has been dealing with since the end of the 20s, in which the quantum theory was, well, since the end of the 70s actually, because once that a field that is called quantum field theory finished putting the last details of what is called the standard model, new physics has been lacking new concepts, and Bohm was very much on that. And the Bohm and Krishnamurti dialogues dealt a lot about these new concepts on nature, to understand nature. But Einstein, who met Bohm when at the beginning of his career, was impressed by Bohm, and then he was saying that Einstein tried to do something about quantum theory and gravity, but he didn't arrive to a conclusion. But he thought that if anyone can do it, then it will be Bohm. So Bohm was a very, very bright guy. Now, some of you may have heard about John Bell. John Bell is a very important physicist about these ideas of entanglement. Entanglement before John Bell inequalities, where it was a issue that generated a lot of discussion and it was not well established. But when John Bell came to establishing his inequalities, that was a revolution in physics that eventually led to other things like quantum computers and things like that. And John Bell studied Bohm's 1952 papers that I will talk about them in a second. And actually John Bell's research was inspired by Bohm's 1952 papers. So he says that his 1952 papers on quantum mechanics were, for me, a revelation. People who have not grasped the ideas of those papers are handicapped in any discussion of the meaning of quantum mechanics. So scientists on board. There were other scientists, but well, those are important. But there are also philosophers, and of course, he established a friendship with the Dalai Lama, and the Dalai Lama considered him to have been one of my scientific gurus. That's I think it's a very funny quote, yeah, of the Dalai Lama having scientific gurus. But also Paul Feyerabend, I hope I am pronouncing it correctly, the philosopher of science, the radical philosopher of sciences. He was friend of Bohm, and then he thought that Bohm's physical ideas are original, refreshing, and sorely needed in a time of complacency with respect to fundamentals. So there, those 4 quotes show how well respected that was Bohm, if not by the mainstream of physics, but very important people, Einstein, Dalai Lama, Feyerabend. But not everything was rosy colors. Robert Oppenheimer, his tutor in his PhD and the father of the atomic bomb, famously said, if we cannot disprove Bohm, then we must agree to ignore him. That's heavy words. I mean, actively, the mainstream physics making active steps to ignore a brilliant physicist because his ideas were very radical. And of course, Martin Gardner, the famous skeptic who wrote a lot of books on magic and recreational mathematics, he talking about the relationship between Bohm and Krishnamurti, he concludes that he was almost as gullible as Conan Doyle. Bohm often had to be saved from idiots. So not everybody was amused by Bohm. But anyway, so in a nutshell, he was born in 1917 in Pennsylvania. His parents, it's an interesting relationship because his parents come from Eastern Europe, from Ukraine, and they were Orthodox Jews that were based traditional Kabbalist people. He got his PhD in 1943 with Oppenheimer. Then it got in trouble because he had communist leanings at the time. So he got in trouble. He was working in Penn State University. He got fired. He couldn't find a job because he was blacklisted. He had to leave the country to have a job. He landed up in Brazil. He stayed in Brazil for about 2 years in Sao Paulo. And then from there, he went to Haifa in Israel, where he got married, among other things, before ending up in England, where he was offered the chair of the theoretical physics at Beaver College at the University of London. I don't know if those who know the University of London, Birkbeck College is a very interesting place. Yeah, it's very, very interesting place. At Birkbeck, there's still working some of his colleagues that you can go and talk to them. I have done that. In 1962, he meets Jiddu Krishnamurti, and from 1962 until the death of Jiddu Krishnamurti in 1986, he had a dialogue, a very long conversation about esoteric themes and everything. Despite that, well, in 1983, he retired. He got very ill a little later, and then he dies in 1992 of a heart attack. So that was him. Now, let me talk a little bit about the causal interpretation, because this kind of it's a first step into an esoteric interpretation of science. So this is a picture of Irma van Klimt that reminded me for some reason the double slit experiment, which you have here in the right hand. So I'm going to come to the dialogues in a second, but I want just to put this Bohm's thought on science really framed to understand a little bit the dialogues and how they evolved. So in 1951, Bohm wrote a very interesting, a very important book on quantum theory. It was an effort to understand what at the time was called the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. It's an interpretation led by Niels Bohr adopted by the main players on the field, Heisenberg and the people working in Denmark with Bohr. And it's from this Copenhagen interpretation, which is not any longer sustained, is from where all these quantum things about the duality well particle and all these experiments, cats and Schrödinger cats and things like that come from. It's about the discussion of this Copenhagen interpretation. It has to be pointed out that this Copenhagen interpretation is not valid anymore, but it is what it has been passed to the public. Bohm tried honestly to understand what they were saying philosophically. His bent was philosophical, and it was very difficult because actually there is no such a thing as a Copenhagen interpretation. There is a set of ideas here and there, some of them contradictory to each other. Heisenberg and Bohr were not at the same. They didn't agree in many things. So Bohm tried to put that in a nice footing. He wrote this book, it became a bestseller, but it's an interesting book because it's a first for a science book in which there is a large amount of attention devoted to philosophical issues in quantum mechanics. Before that, philosophy was not to be read in a physics book. If you open that book, the Quantum Theory of 1951, you will find a lot of philosophy. At some point, Bohm says quantum mechanics is a misnomer, should be called quantum non-mechanics. Interesting. And then, very interestingly, it is the first time that appears in a physics book the issue of mind and matter. Yeah, Bohm begins to talk in 1951 about the relationship between mind and matter in a physics book. So this is long before all these physics of consciousness things. So this is a very precursor thing. So you have the double slit experiment. One of my ambitions one day is to do a workshop called Basics Quantum Mechanics for Theosophists, so that they understand really what is happening, because it's amazing what it is happening. You don't need a PhD on physics to understand what it is happening, and it is completely unresolvable. You get like, what? There must be a mistake, and everybody feels that. And it's a very simple experiment. It's a very simple experiment, and you get the anxiety that all physicists have of there is something that is not quite right with this thing, or with the behavior of an electron passing through that. So it's my ambition one day to do that, because part of my work here was to say, if we are going to explore this relationship between science and the esotericism needs to understand science to a certain level. It cannot be just a passing, superficial, popular book level. There has to be some deeper understanding. So in 1952, after having written that book and just not understanding much about the Copenhagen interpretation, Bohm writes his papers that he is most famous from, which called a suggested interpretation of the quantum theory in terms of hidden variables. There were not just two articles, there were like 5 or 6 articles. So it proposes his new interpretation, in which there is this, which eventually was called the causal interpretation. The hidden variables is not very, very nice title. It was not very well received. He wrote that with the aim to enter into a dialogue with the physics community, and the physics community ignored him because some point, and this is a point very important. This is a very important point for what will be discussed later in the dialogues, and also for the outcome of the dialogues, because there is a practical thing there. Bohm, at the time, the only interpretation valid that was thought that it did well, and there is a theorem by John von Neumann that said that a hidden variables interpretation was not possible, but then Bohm came with one, and it was valid. But then the physics, the mainstream, choose to ignore him, like you saw what the Oppenheimer was saying. And that attitude shocked completely Bohm. to the point that he was completely dissatisfied with physics. He become much more philosophical. This was written while he was in Sao Paulo, actually. So just so that you see it, and then one day, well, that's the quantum potential. The trick is that, well, the definite thing that changed the causal interpretation from the orthodox interpretation is that in the orthodox interpretation, this marriage between particle and wave and all bits entangled and very difficult to understand. In the causal interpretation, no, you have a particle and you have a wave, and it's different, and there is a definite trajectory, and everything becomes you can imagine it. And it is all done because this quantum potential. Now, this is very important because it is a first entrance of an esoteric concept in the equation of physics, what it will become later, what Bohm called the implicate order, that he discussed a lot with Krishnamurti in the dialogues. That is the first expression of that. Is the quantum potential. The equations that in which this quantum potential appears is a transformation of the Schrödinger equation into a form, into a classical form, into a Hamiltonian form, that's called like that. It appears that quantum potential, and everything looks classical, but the quantum potential. And the quantum potential is a very strange thing, very, very strange thing. It appears magically. It doesn't have sinks or sources. It is not generated. It is non-local. It explains entanglement. There is a certain holism. So they criticized it to death because they thought, well, this is going back to the orthodox. It is going back to the classical time, but it was not. The quantum potential is something very, very strange. But then this was another unfortunate encounter with fixed orthodox positions. Yeah. So I'm putting this as examples of what Krishnamurti and Bohm will discuss extensively about these attitudes of coming with something new, and then an orthodoxy completely not wanting to enter into the dialogue because fixed positions of thought. Yeah. So Bohm had at this point two examples of inflexibility that have had enormous consequences for his life. So I think it's important. Well, the quantum potential is there so that you have seen it at least once in your life. The U is equal to you see the Planck constant h bar there. Yeah. After that, when he moved, he wrote this book in Bristol after he has been in Jaifa, and then he began to articulate his philosophical agenda more explicitly. So this is book Causality and Chance in Modern Physics. So it is a investigation on the dialectical relationship between determinism and chance in physics law, supported by some pioneer and research in chaos theory that show that the race of contingency within the realm of determinism and mechanical laws. So the interesting thing here is that he's postulating something that he called the qualitative infinite of nature, which is kind of a Neoplatonic ladder of implicate orders that he will develop later in his ontological interpretation. And this qualitative infinity of nature, this discussion of the Neoplatonic concept will appear a lot in the dialogues between Krishnamurti and Bohm. They will discuss and this will be part of the contents of the dialogues. And it begins to show Bohm begin to talk in a very in esoteric terms already. So for example, this is a quote from that book: nature was not limited, but was infinite in its qualities. Nature is infinitely rich and all woven together into a whole, where opposites are woven together in a dialectic, in the dynamical dialectic. And then using these concepts, Bohm begins to criticize what he calls the mechanistic philosophy, whose main characteristics are to reduce all laws of nature to finite number of objects and laws. And but in case of Bohm, he exploded everything. For him, nature was an infinite thing that you cannot be put in finite terms. One interesting thing, and I will come to that in a second, is that at this point, when Bohm went to Brazil, to Sao Paulo, he was a Marxist at that time, but he didn't know. But then his friends in Sao Paulo, they taught him that actually the philosophy that was lying under Marx was the Hegel philosophy, and he began to read the logic. Now, Hegel's logic is a book of ontology. Yeah? It's a book of ontology. All the Hegelian categories and the Hegelian dialectics are in the logic, and then that goes very, very, very to the heart of Bohm's esotericism, and that is when it begins to get interesting. So, Bohm's esotericism. Why I maintain that Bohm was an esoteric thinker, and why he was naturally led to people like Krishnamurti and other esoteric thinkers that he encountered. And well, you see him there. He is in the physics laboratory of Birkbeck's college, bending spoons with Uri Geller, right? His colleagues were horrified by this, yeah, because Bohm saw Uri Geller in television, and then he got very excited, and then well, he was very open-minded, and then he invited Uri Geller, and then they are bending spoons, and then Basil Hill, his colleague, told me one day that he had a very, very serious chat with Bohm after that, because it was, how can a physicist of his credibility had to be bending spoons with Uri Geller. Anyway, so it's kind of so he's one of the main features of Bohm philosophy at the time is this ontological holism, which is akin to a mystical unification in which the main category includes everything. Holism, and this is a term that was introduced by the South American statesman Jan Smuts in a book called Holism and Evolution in 1927, and referring to a complex of unities which is differentiated from their environments and whose behavior is not explainable by the analysis of its constituents. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. That's the point. The reach for wholeness was not something that Bohm learned reading, actually. He was not just a thinking philosopher. He had these experiences when seeing light as reaching out and all the lights reaching into the darkness and contacting everything. I sort of entered the world of light. I had this vision of super intense light awareness of something more real, super intense awareness of a pervasive light in which everything could be seen as it is. I mean, this is a mystical state. This is something very. He didn't read it. He experienced this. Yeah, and so he put him in a very different place, because he not only experienced it, he was talking about it, and he was trying to make a philosophy out of it. So, but his philosophy goes beyond the simple statement of the unity of the world. So it's not just a holism, but for Bohm, the nature of the totality was movement. So the holism is pure movement. It's not things, it's not objects, it's movement. And that is one of the things that he will discuss with Krishnamurti extensively, because it requires a change in our minds to make the shift from thinking the world in terms of objects to thinking the world in terms of movement. Yeah, and this movement, he invented this neologism called the holo movement to explain this idea that the core of the things was the movements, and the objects were the result of the movements, and all this was the totality, and they were meshed together. So of course this is a very is something that all these had to do with mind, it has to do with matter, it was to do with the way we talk. He tried to invent a language in which everything was a verb, yeah, that he called the Rio mode, and he tried to speak in that way, but no one was understanding him, so he abandoned the idea. But he did try to change his mind so that he could see and talk using the hollow movement, yeah. And then we will see in a second why this is interesting in regards to Krishnamurti. But let me just point out a little detail with so Bohmian misses in regards to Hegel. Well, and this has to do with this quote that that I love from Madame Blavatsky, because I always put it there, because she says that outside a certain highly spiritual and elevated state of mind, during which mind is at one with the universe, with the universal mind, he can get not but relative truth or truth from whatsoever philosophy or religion. So what Blavatsky is saying here is that probably we can have a perception of truth, but we cannot say it. When we end up particularizing it, I mean, when you end up expressing it, it gets particularized and it goes like closer. You never, or we never get to the totality of truth, or the truth completely and absolutely. And this is actually which is in line with the Western esoteric tradition, and it has been as it has been articulated since the Renaissance. This is not something that Blavatsky is coming as an original thought. She is actually saying something that others have said before her, yeah, in the Western esoteric tradition. Truth is not attainable. And in completion, it's actually one of the Yetziratic texts related to one of the spheres of the tree of life, the Keter, and the Yetziratic text says, no created being can attain to its essential truth. This is the quote. So he was saying like that. So this is an interesting point, very, very interesting point, because Bohm was embracing Hegel, and Hegel can be seen as an esoteric philosopher. Actually, Alexander McGee, his book Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, shows how Hegel's system is modeled as an initiatory process, and his ontology, which is the subject of his logic, is based on the Christian Kabbalah, via Jacob Boehm, via some of the relationships that Hegel had with Freemasons and Schiller and some of his friends. So Hegel can be seen as an esoteric thinker, and in many ways Bohm's philosophy was reproducing Hegel's system, except for one very important point, which is this issue about the accessibility of the truth, which will be an important point for the conclusions that they will be reaching between Krishnamurti and Bohm. And the important point is that truth cannot be reached. For Hegel, reality can be reached. There is the absolute idea. You can see it. I mean, you can when you read Hegel, the dialectic movement, which starts with being, ends up with the absolute idea, and Hegel is claiming that he got it. But at this point, Bohm being very, very on to the Hegelian ideal, he departs from Hegel very consciously, not knowing very explicitly that that was the position of the esoteric idea. So it is an unconscious but very emphatic adoption of an esoteric standpoint, right? This issue about everything is a movement that is not finished, everything something that is not quite complete, that we can progress, but every step is something that on its own has to be recompleted. So never-ending point of view is a never-ending step. So this, for example, this idea of the never-ending finishing and the never-ending reaching complete truth it is portrayed in the tarot in many ways, for example, and in the Kabbalah it's expressed in many ways. So Bohm, and it will appear a lot as the discussions that Krishnamurti and Bohm had in relation to very practical things, as I will explain in a second. So this is a very interesting point from the standpoint of Bohm. Now, let's now get to the nitty-gritty of the dialogue. Sorry. So there you have the Bohm and Krishnamurti dialogue. So Bohm moved to London, ended up in London, and took the chair of the Birkbeck of the physics of the theoretical physics at Birkbeck's College in 1961. And then he read a book by Krishnamurti, yeah, The End of Time. And then it was the end of time. Well, I don't remember quite well at the moment which book that was, but it was a book that his wife has brought from the library, and he got super excited with it because he read the phrase "observing the observer," yeah, and his wife, who had seen that phrase, he thought, oh. David is talking about the observed and the observer all the time, so I will bring him the book. So Bohm got very, very excited. He contacted Krishnamurti. They met in 1962, and they become very close friends very, very quickly. And Bohm become very, very close collaborator of Krishnamurti almost immediately. Yeah. And so from the collaboration lasted for 25 years until Krishnamurti died, right? Bohm was involved later in Brookwood Park. He attended yearly the meetings in Cannes and in Switzerland. The Krishnamurti was a regular big visitor to Oak Grove in Ohio, and he became a trustee of Krishnamurti Foundation. So he was really very much on Krishnamurti. At the time, some people thought that he was his main disciple, and there was some political issues happened, not very nice. This relationship has been described a little bit here and there, not always bringing to light the difficulties that it had, because it was not all rosy. Yeah, they have their issues. But apart from all this involvement of Bohm with Krishnamurti, there were the dialogues, which were conversations between them. They seated and naturally they began to talk, and some of them were recorded. Some are formal conversations between the two, which with videotaped and recorded as in all professional way. Some of them are published in forms of books. I will give you a couple of them in a second. Some of them are informal conversations recorded in a kitchen. Yeah, there is a book called The Kitchen Dialogues, which portray how informal some of them were. The first ones were in 1965 in Sanen, after a gathering of Sanen in Switzerland. So and there were like a few other people present. The last Krishnamurti dialogue took place in 1983, and a book called The Future of Humanity was published with some parts of this conversation, and it's also in YouTube. You can see the conversation in YouTube. If you put The Future of Humanity in YouTube, you get all this stuff. Now, by the time the relationship between Krishnamurti and Bohm had kind of deteriorated a little bit, in 1983, Bohm got very ill after his retirement, and he had a triple bypass. And Krishnamurti, well, there was an issue there. Apparently, Krishnamurti was not very patient with him, and Bohm got very hurt, and it was drama and all that. I mean, like, no deep relationships. But then they heal it, but their dialogue was not as dynamic as before. So what you are seeing, most of the things that you are seeing in YouTube do not have the dynamism of the conversations that they had before, which apparently they were amazing, that they was ideas and energy, etc. So it's so just to warn you of what you can see on YouTube. These encounters were very inspiring, energizing, and intellectually uplifting for both of them. they enjoy their explorations and were very inspired by them. Uh, Bohm was an incredibly articulated person, and he was an absolute towering intellect. I mean, he was amazing. Someone who knew him, Basil Healy, once they told me that I was talking to him, and then we were talking about David Bohm, and he told me that whatever the conversation was, as soon as David was involved, the level of the conversation was bang, leap, a quantum leap above the regular level. And Bohm's capacity helped Krishnamurti to articulate ideas that otherwise Krishnamurti found difficult to express. Yeah? Krishnamurti had his limitations, and Bohm helped him enormously. It's said that many times when they were talking, Krishnamurti just had to leave the room because he was overwhelmed by Bohm's brilliance. So I just want to put the emphasis on this relationship. Bohm was really the leading light on these dialogues. Yeah, Krishnamurti was putting the spiritual part. Of course, Krishnamurti had a direct experience with consciousness, and that for Bohm was very important because he believed on that experience with consciousness, but he didn't have something like that. Krishnamurti was the evidence of this level of attainment, but that he never reached. Yeah, so this was kind of the attraction between these two very, very different persons. Yeah, Krishnamurti and all. So there is some of the dialogues. Well, in my thesis there is a much more elaborated description of each one of the dialogues, and then there is a list with who they are and where you can find them and what they are all about. But you can find them, well, in some of the books. The Ending of Time in 1985, The Future of Humanity of 86, The Limits of Thought of 1999, and then you can actually download them if you go to Krishnamurti, or I mean they have a very nice. You go there and then you put Bohm, and then you have a huge list of dialogues, like 52 dialogues that you can download from there. Also, you have a website dedicated to the dialogues, which is called Bohm-Krishnamurti. All these things, some of them have been developed after I wrote the thesis. And also in YouTube there is a Bohm's channel, so you can see that. So you can see some of the dialogues there. So it's an interesting. You can elaborate on it in those websites if you desire. So of course, after reading my thesis, of course, that will have explained everything. Of course. Anyway, so the core of the dialogues, what there were, a lot of them were, as I said, things that Bohm had been thinking, and then he was bringing them to talk with Krishnamurti, and this is a surprising acknowledgement by a major scientist talking about a major scientific idea that he was thinking on, and credited as an esoteric inspiration, which I think is very important for modern physics, because modern physics, as I said, has this schizophrenic state in which there is quantum field theory and the general theory of relativity, that both describe different parts of the universe, and they don't mix, and they are in need of concepts, of new concepts. Actually, the inauguration conference for Birkbeck's College of Bohm was called the looking for new concepts in physics. Physics needs new concepts. And this is an interesting example of an esoteric conversation having an impact on new concepts in physics. Actually, Einstein criticized the causal interpretation, the original interpretation, because the causal interpretation didn't have really a new insight in concepts. And Bohm become convinced or become moved towards the standpoint of Einstein, that what was needed not just a shift and a rearrangement of the standard quantum mechanics equations as he has done in the causal interpretation, but that new concepts were needed. And then he came with, in his book, Wholeness and the Implicate Order, which is one of his most famous books in 1980, published in 1980. So he introduced these terms, hollow movement, which contains the idea of the movement as the constituent of nature in a holism stance. And he says, and suddenly I had that insight that it was necessary that the movement as itself was a state of being. There was the idea that motion was first and being was part of it. Reality as an unbroken wholeness of the totality of existence, as an undivided flowing movement without borders. Pretty esoteric. I mean, this is pretty philosophical. And then understanding the process as fundamental and being a secondary requires mental work. That's an important idea for what comes after, for what I am calling Bohm's yoga. These changes of mind, active changes of mind, yeah. So he introduced the concept of the implicate order in this article, which is printed in that book, in Wholeness and the Implicate Order. But interestingly, he, of course, left many of those things undefined, as many things in philosophy or in the esoteric. There are things that cannot be defined. So he just makes metaphors for it, like for the example of an hologram. There is people that put Bohm in an holographic paradigm. That is, to my view, pure nonsense, because the hologram for Bohm was a mechanism to explain something else. He was not there saying that the universe was a hologram, which is a thing. And Bohm was saying that the universe is not made of things, it's made of movements. Yeah. Well, and then he gone to talk about the limits of language and the realm of. But the interesting thing is that all these ideas that he was talking about, I did follow these things up with Krishnamurti. We had many discussions. I think partly through these discussions, although not entirely, I came to the idea of the implicate order. And then he used it to encourage me in that direction. So this is an example of an idea who has become part of some physics in the ontological interpretation that came out of these discussions between Bohm and his esoteric teacher, right? So this quote is from an interview with Bill Angelos in 1990, 2 years before he passed. Now, there is one thing that it is very important of all the subjects, because there are many subjects covered in the dialogue. Usually, if you see the dialogues, they begin in a very friendly way, that they begin saying, oh, the world is in a state, in a terrible state. I wonder what they will say today with the COVID, right? More than terrible state. But they were beginning like, why are we in such a terrible state, and what are we going to solve? And then they wanted to change the mind, to change the state of the world. And then they consider that the fragmented state of our knowledge, they spend lots of time talking, lots of space talking about fragmentation, how the mind makes divisions of things and puts them apart, breaking the wholeness. And then they consider this fragmentation state of our knowledge and the many difficulties that our society faces due to this fragmentation. So we need to remember that these dialogues happened when the Cold War was still going on, and the menace of nuclear war was something that was very real in those times. So they were very aware of it, of the menace of entering into a nuclear war, and then they were trying to find solutions for that. So they're common in that kind of affairs. They were investigating what was the cause, how to remediate it. And so these the dynamics of thought as that fragments, that it is not such a bad thing in itself, but it is something, it's a natural tendency of thought, but that needs to be understood and take aware of it. So because he says things like, now I say that this system of thought has a fault in it, a systematic fault. It is not a fault here or there, but it's a fault that is all throughout the system. It is everywhere and nowhere. You may say, I see a problem here, so I will bring my thoughts to bear on this problem. But my thought is part of the system. It has the same fault as the fault I am trying to look at, or a similar fault. And when we have this systematic fault, and you can see that this is what has been going on in all these problems of the world, such as the problems that the fragmentation of nations has produced. So here is a fault, something has gone wrong, but in dealing with it, we use the same kind of fragmentary thought that produced the problem, just a somewhat different version of it. Therefore, it's not going to help, and it may make things worse. So we live in a world that is created by our thoughts, by this fragmentation, and thought it obeys these laws. But in solving the problems, what Bohm is saying is that if this thought has caused that problem, the solution is not further thought, because that just causes more fragmentation and then more problems. What he's saying and what they are trying to achieve and understand and articulate through the dialogues is, how do you get out of that fragmentation of thought? And this is kind of the most practical points in their whole conversations. This going back to how do I step back kind of in a mystical state in which I can encounter this wholeness, as I was saying before, how we experience this movement and wholeness, how to provoke it, how to provoke this, so that we can go beyond the fragmentation of thought, so that we can solve the problem. So their aim was practical. It was not just philosophical. They were aiming to obtain something that could resolve these problems of fragmentation of thought. So, and one of the things that he was saying is that we don't see the whole of the thought process and its automatic aspects, because and in thought he is including not only intellectual thought, but it's also including emotions and the whole enchilada of who we are. He was putting in thought, and he said, well, part of this thought process, we are aware of it, but then we lose sight of the thought process, and the thought process continues and provoking its problems, but we don't know anymore that's that thought that we participated at some point, which is causing the problem. So that is one problem. And also, in dealing with these problems, sometimes we make maps to navigate through these thoughts, and then we end up lost in the map and confusing the map with the reality, right? So all this is due to the operation of thought through fragmentation, which again, he's not saying that fragmentation is bad. What he's saying is that fragmentation we need to understand and take it into consideration, this fragmentation, so that we can deal with it. It's natural, it's good, it produces the world, but we need to consider it. And then in some way, they or Bohm come up with this concept of the proprioception of thought. Now he says at some point, he says something like all the problems of the world are due to the lack of proprioception of thought. So let me explain. The proprioception applies to the knowledge that the body has on its own position. We don't see our hand, we raise our hand, we know exactly what it is, the hand. That's proprioception. We are aware of the places where all on which our body is. We are aware of our position, we are aware of where our hands are, where our feet are, etc. He said, thought does not have proprioception property, and we need to develop it as a mental skill. Yeah, and he articulates that in this form of lack of proprioception. And this proprioception is what they are ending up calling things like observing the observer, and related things that are a form of mental self-seeing or self-awareness of things. So the reality seeing reality, the self seeing the self, etc. Thinking thought, or thought thinking about thought, and thinking that it is thinking about thinking. So they were articulating these things in this way, but what they were aiming is not to they were aiming to do this articulation in some way, but the aim was to actually enter into the practice of it. Yeah, they never give a practical result, right? So that's I will talk a little bit more about what is the consequences of all this in when I get to the conclusions. I want just to now to put some ideas, some comments on what was the last interpretation effort of David Bohm, which has a result of all these dialogues. What did the dialogues did for us? Well, they ended up in this physics material, which is the ontological interpretation. So the slide is in purpose like that. Well, of course, it's a Kandinsky, my favorite paint. Paint, and then you see that I put the ontological interpretation kind of blending with the background to suggest wholeness and thought coming out of wholeness. So it's a kind of a joke. So the ontological interpretation. So the ontological interpretation was the subject of several papers at the end of the life of Bohm, and it ended up being all put together in a book called The Undivided Universe. It's a physics book, a proper physics book. However, the question of mind and matter have changed from the old, you remember the old quantum mechanics books of 1951, who has a little section on mind and matter. Here, there are two big last chapters on mind and matter with experiments and etc., etc. The first part of the book is about a new version, not of the causal interpretation, but a much more elaborated interpretation, taking into consideration the implicate order, the infinite ladder of implicates orders, because he postulated that there is the order in which we are aware there is an implicate order, but there is a super implicate order that it's in relation to the implicate order as the implicate order is to us. And that was part of the discussions with the Krishnamurti. But then they went all the way. So there is a super implicate order, and on and on and on in an infinite ladder. And matter is just the name of the relationship, because one level is material, the level above is mental, and this relationship stands in all the levels. So it's something familiar to an esoteric thinker, this Neoplatonic ladder, in which in a level there is an objectivity and a materialism, and at the next level it becomes subjective and mental. It is named the ontological interpretation to make emphasis in a holistic process ontology. So it is movement, is holistic, and that's the ontology. The things is things that are movement, and the mathematics that are there are the mathematics that are trying to capture this holistic process ontology. Now, this work has been done with one of his collaborators, Basil Healy, that succeeded Bohm in the chair of physics at Birkbeck's College. It is interesting because Basil was telling me one day that Bohm actually had very often the maths wrong, because the physics, he feel them. So he was feeling in himself the physics things that he was talking about, which is a very interesting thing, because this is something that it is close to the esoteric tradition. In fact, the universe and the laws of nature are laws of that we are incorporated in our being, and then we can feel them. So this is an interesting comment, I thought, because it makes the relation that this Bohm had this perception of things, and often he just wrote the math, but the math were wrong and then had to be corrected by better mathematicians like Bassett, who was a very good mathematician. Now, this interpretation, this last effort, or basically the efforts of Bohm that capture all these dialogues with Krishnamurti, all these influences, not only the Krishnamurti influences, but also other lectures and other people that he met. There was a lot of substantial esoteric thought and philosophy, I think, as I have explained, that come into the interpretation, but it has been completely ignored, completely ignored. Some physicists that claim themselves as Bohmian think that Bohm just went crazy and with all this philosophy. And then there is even a movement called Physics Without Philosophy, following Bohm. And then that's something that is happening in Germany. There is a group there doing things like that. And most people, when they talk about Bohm importance in physics, are talking about the 1952 papers, ignoring the subsequent philosophical and esoteric developments of Bohm, because Bohm had abandoned the 1952 papers very soon after talking with Einstein about them. You know, he was very disappointed. He wanted new concepts, he wanted new ways, and then he wanted to put all these esoteric things in the equations. So it's very small population of physicists that are really on that. Well, the ideas are much more radical, and Bohm is asking to make actually mental efforts, which not everybody is ready to do. So this is the Undivided Universe. It's a physics book, amazing book, fantastic. Another book in which that Bohm wrote in 1987, containing a lot of these ideas, is a very radical book. For me, it's the most radical book of Bohm. It's called Science, Order, and Creativity. He wrote it in 1987, a year after Krishnamurti had passed, with his friend David Pett, the guy who wrote the biography that I recommended at the start. And it is way more radical. In many ways, it reads as a Kabbalistic book. So, and it doesn't have too many equations. It has some physics, but not too many, and it's more philosophy, and it is very interesting. And it is trying to put the implicate order, the Olo movement, as a philosophy of everything, a philosophy of nature, as a philosophy of mind, as a philosophy of art. He was very interesting in Serrat and other in Cézanne. He had a period in which he was very interested with Cézanne and discussed that with Krishnamurti in the dialogues. And but he discussed a little bit about that in Science, Order, and Creativity. And he talks about these super implicate orders and this ladder of Neoplatonic spiritual level. So if you want to get a glimpse of what Bohm was thinking at the end of his life, this is the way to go: Science, Order, and Creativity. Yeah. Now let's talk about what I call Bohm's yoga. And the point is that at the end of when Krishnamurti passed, I mean, there was a reflection about the dialogues, because what did the dialogues were amazing, interesting, inspiring, all what you want, but were very unpractical. There was not a practice. Yeah, they talk a lot about this fragmentation and the need to do a change of mind, but there were no the means. Everything was intellectual, everything was lectures, everything was two guys talking intellectually together. Yeah, there was not something that could become a practice or an esoteric practice or even a form of meditation. And Bohm, after Krishnamurti passed, for several reasons, got very depressed.
Just a minute, Orlando. We have closed 1 hour, just to let you know. Some people may wish to ask questions.
Okay, I will finish in 10 minutes. Yeah,
okay.
I will shorten. So Bohm went to have a treatment with Patrick Demar, and Patrick Demar was forming these groups of dialogue. And Bohm inspired by it, created a technique. There is a book by Bohm called On Dialogue, and then Bohm wanted to put all these things that he has discussed with Krishnamurti in a more practical standing. And then so there is a Bohmian dialogue, which includes these groups of people in which you enter into a discussion with a very open mind and try to see the world and go beyond these fragmentations. But there is one problem, and it's a problem that it happens, in my opinion, with a lot of esoteric groups. The individual practice is very important. If one is to participate in a Bohmian group, it needs to have a particular and individual practice of trying to go beyond this fragmentation of thought. You need to have been doing something on your own, so that when you enter into the group, do not get to a certain level in which these dynamics that Bohm was aiming, that collectively enter into a perception of holism and solve problems, could happen. It never happened. When they formed these groups, what ended up happening is that Bohm was talking, and people were not came without having this effort. So, but dialogues, the Bohmian dialogues, is a fantastic idea to put something practical, but it failed because this individual thing. Now, I want to go and do some conclusions, and this is the first conclusion: is effectively this having is that we need to practice what we talk about. I mean, because as I say, well, the dialogues, yeah, is very beautiful, very influential, very inspirational. But what is the practice? How do I bring it into my life? Thoreau, the American philosopher, in Walden, he says there are nowadays professors of philosophy, but not philosophers. Yet it's admirable to profess because it was once admirable to live. And then that goes along with some of the thoughts of Pierre Hadot, a French philosopher, about early Greek philosophy as a form of living, not as an intellectual pursuit, but as a form of living. And that's something that I think it is very important to understand. It is very nice to have lectures. It is very nice to read. It is very nice to enter into discussions and dialogues and all. But there has to be an impact beyond the purely intellectual. There has to be an effort to live the things, and there has to be really an effort to embrace the things that we live with. It's very nice and very beautiful to think on the oneness of life, and at the first opportunity abandon the idea to behave as in the same way that we have always lived. Unfortunately, this attitude that we see in philosophy, for example, in our universities, because our universities now, what's philosophy in our universities? Just a scholar writing things, but his life has nothing to do with his philosophy. And this is something that is happening also to esotericism, because esotericism has been established as an academy pursuit, and it's exactly the same. The esoterists that work in an academia, they are not living esoterics. There are people studying books, making the esoteric not an experience but a literature, and their standpoint, their philosophical standpoint, is most of the time postmodern, leading and radically stepped on this fragmentation. So in frank contradiction with the philosophy of holism that the esoteric is proposing. So one of my conclusions is that, and actually it was kind of a disappointment, why all this if we are not living it? We need to live it. Now, that's my first conclusion. The second conclusion is here the tarot, because this interaction between the esoteric and science that many people is very interested, I think that it has not been properly dealt. It has been the discussion on the relationship between philosophy and science, and I will make this very brief because I can speak about this for ages, but it has not been dealt from the point of view of the esoteric. It has been subservient to science, because science is all what we people want to do. Science is the master of the mind, and we all have to be according to science, and it's not true. Yeah, science is an endeavor as anything else, and then the esoteric does not need to be subservient to science. Yeah, it can stand on its own, and it doesn't need to be justified by science. It has to be a dialogue, and it has to include in some way, but in the same way as art, sociology, philosophy, or anything else, right? And I just want to point out that this kind of standpoint, it is this relationship between science and the esoteric is well portrayed within the esoteric tradition, and then it's content there how to deal with it. For example, these two keys are talking about this relationship. They have to these two keys say a lot about the proper relationship between the study of nature and the inner. Yeah, you see the four cherubim there representing the elements, which represents the world, and you see the ladders of interiority, in which the last in the wheel of fortune, the last circle is the physical world, but there are other inners, but each stage it has its own completion, and then you have the three gunas there and all the alchemical symbols in between, and then there is this point of view about the world and even the physical world, as you see the cherubim there, and seeing the dancer at the center of the world. So these are there is a lot of things that could be said about this relationship in more general terms, not just in the case of Bohm, but in more general terms, that the ancient wisdom or the arcane wisdom or the in modern forms, like in these two cards, can be discussed. So I think that this study of the relationship between science and the esotericism had to change radically in its tone and its standpoint to make progress, because there is a lot to, not just because it has to be a lot of offers to science, it's because it's the natural thing to do. We have to abandon the pretension to be scientific. Let's be esoteric.